Well, this is going to be a little bit different of a message today. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of how things all fit together in the scriptures, especially lately with me. I've been doing it lately. I've been jumping from Jeremiah to Ezra to Nehemiah and back and forth, and it can get a little hard to keep track of when and where and all these things that are happening in there. So I'm going to put this, all of these guys about this time on a timeline together. A timeline of Jeremiah, Ezra, but also I'm including Esther, because she's right in the middle of all of this. So, basically, when you look at this, I'm going to be starting over here at about 600 AD. Okay? I'm sorry, that's not AD. That should be BC. I don't know how that happened. I obviously did that late at night, and I was, those are all wrong. Those should all be BC. Unless somebody's pranking me on something. I couldn't believe I did that. But those should all be BC, 600 BC to roughly 400 BC. Okay? And when you're looking at the book of Jeremiah, when you're reading that, Jeremiah actually begins over here before 600 BC, during the reign of Josiah. It's perhaps just a couple of years, his reign or his ministry begins just a couple of years after that incident where the book of the law is found and the Torah is found. That's about 622 BC is about when Jeremiah's ministry begins. And this is some 15 years before Daniel gets taken off to exile. They had surrendered essentially to Babylon in the early 600s. And he gets taken away to exile in about 605 BC. And it's estimated that Daniel is around 15 years old when he gets taken off into captivity, when he leaves Jerusalem. So he may have been born about the same time that Jeremiah even started his ministry. But it definitely means that Daniel probably heard or even could have read some of Jeremiah's messages before he left. Because when you read through the book of Daniel, you'll see he has an awareness of Jeremiah already within that book. You see this here in Jeremiah chapter 1. He says, the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the Kohanim, so he's a priest, who were in Anatoth in the land of Benjamin. The word of Adonai came to him during the days of King Josiah of Judah, son of Ammon, in the 13th year of his reign. Okay, the 13th year of his reign. And it continued, his ministry continued during the days after Josiah dies, in the days of Jehoiakim of Judah, son of Josiah, until the end of the 11th year of King Zedekiah of Judah, son of Josiah, until the exile from Jerusalem in the 5th month. And that tells us, that's about where we lose track of exactly what happens to Jeremiah. He was alive until the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 586 BC. Okay? So again, those should all be BC, and it's going to be messed up for the entire message, and it's really going to bug me the whole time. But, so about 586 BC, the temple gets destroyed. Okay? And after that, after what happens to Jeremiah, at that point, he gets taken down into Egypt against his will, and he presumably dies there, or nobody really knows exactly what happens to him at that point. But we read more about the time before the fall of the temple and what happens in those times afterwards. We read about that in Daniel. King Josiah, he dies in about 609. So again, he's a little bit over here. in the 609 BC, while he actually goes to war against Egypt. Egypt then defeated him, killed him, appointed a man, Jehoiakim, shortly after this, and we read this in Daniel. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. God gave King Jehoiakim of Judah into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. So they're stealing things from the temple. He brought them into the land of Shinar to the house of his God and put the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Then the king told Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel from royal descent and nobility, youths without any defect, handsome, proficient in all wisdom, knowledgeable, intelligent, and capable of serving in the king's palace. He was to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. It says the king allotted them a daily portion from the king's delicacies and from the wine that he drank, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end of that they were to stand before the king. Now among them were some from the sons of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So that means Daniel is of what kind of family? He's of the royal line, right? That's an important thing to keep in mind. And so he is there for 3 years, even before he meets the king. And then you read at the end of the 1st chapter of Daniel, it says Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Okay, so here we are with 600 and 586 BC. The reign of Cyrus the Great starts about 559 BC. So when Daniel gets taken away at 605, and this is that period of the captivity of Babylon, Cyrus is the king of which nation, which country? Y'all know? He's of Persia. So he's the one that came after Babylon. He's one of those that defeated Babylon. And so this 1st year of King Cyrus is actually starting, they're counting this in the book of Daniel from when he defeated Babylon. Okay? He was consolidating his power back in modern-day Iran for a while before he moved to Babylon. And we see this in Ezra chapter 1. He says, now in the 1st year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order to accomplish the word of Adonai from the mouth of Jeremiah, Adonai stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to make a proclamation throughout his entire kingdom, announcing a written edict, saying, thus says King Cyrus of Persia, Adonai, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a house for him in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Okay? So here is probably the most powerful man on earth at the time, one of anyway. And he is moving and responding and answering to the God of Israel, Adonai. He's even called an anointed one in Isaiah. But he is, for whatever reason, God put it on his heart to do this. So we see this in the reign of Cyrus the Great. In 539 is when he defeats Babylon, and that's when the Jews are allowed to return to Israel. That's when they start building the foundation of the temple. And what's interesting is during all of this, Daniel is still living. Daniel is still alive during the reign of Cyrus, because he's actually alive until the reign of the guy after him, which is Darius. We'll get to that in just a minute. Daniel is still living, and he is able to hear the pronouncements about Jerusalem. He's able to hear the pronouncements about the temple. And he would have, he knew about Jeremiah. He knew about that warning. He knew he had seen the fulfillment of the 70 years of exile prophesied about, and he was even still having visions in his own life and ministry. You look at Daniel chapter 10. So this is 539 is roughly, they consider that the first year for Cyrus, because he's now taken over Babylon. But it says, in the 3rd year of King Cyrus of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. The oracle was true and concerns a great war. And he understood the message and gained insight through this vision. So he is there in this 3rd year. Oops, I'm missing something here. Well, I mentioned Darius a few minutes ago. Darius is actually Cyrus's uncle. And Cyrus appointed Darius as king in Babylon to rule. That's when, in Daniel chapter 7, in the lion's den, that's when that takes place, is when Darius is king over that. Daniel is in his 80s at this point. So he is an old man getting thrown into the lion's den. And Darius becomes king over the whole of Persia after Cyrus's death. And so in all that kind of change of leadership, Ezra is relating the history of what was going on in Israel in those days. It says, then the people of the land began discouraging the people of Judah and making them afraid to build. They bribed advisors in order to thwart their plans all the days of King Cyrus of Persia and until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Let's see here. But Ezra's history goes even beyond Darius and into the life of someone that we just read about this past week, right? With Esther. It says, during the reign of Ahasuerus, if I'm saying it correctly, Gabriel, at the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Also during the days of Artaxerxes, that's his son. Ahasuerus is also known as Xerxes. But Bishlam, Mithredath, Tabeel, and the rest of his associates wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia. The letter was written in Aramaic and translated. So here again on our timeline, 539, they're allowed to return. Cyrus dies about 530. After a few years of some turmoil, Darius comes to power in about 522, and he reigns until about 486. We read about the next king, Ahasuerus, Xerxes, comes to power after Darius. In the opening of the book of Esther, we read about him. So in about 486, or that, give or take. And then Artaxerxes, his son, comes to power in about 465. We read about this here. It says, so the elders of the Jews continued building and prospering through the prophesying of Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah. So those guys were living and doing their ministry at this time. The sons of Edo, they finished building according to the command of the God of Israel and according to the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. So that's an important marker. Then the sons of Israel, the Kohanim, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. So when you come back to this, we've had mention of all of these different kings of Persia. They're allowed to return in 539. They finish the temple in about 515. That second temple is dedicated. Okay, it was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of King Darius. Okay, then we read about Xerxes. This is what happened in the days of Ahasuerus, the Xerxes, who reigned over provinces from India to Ethiopia. And at that time, King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in the castle in Shushan. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his princes and his servants. So then, after about 4 years in chapter 2 of Esther, she gets elevated. So this happened in the 3rd year. Then Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus at his royal house in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won his grace and favor more than all the other virgins. So he placed the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So it was several years after Vashti was deposed before Esther was put into that position. But the time, keeps marching on, and then Haman gets elevated a few years after this. So sometime later, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and setting his chair above all the officials who were with him. So in verse 5 it says, when Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down or paying him honor, this is the incident that got everything started, Haman was filled with rage, but it was repugnant in his eyes to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him the identity of Mordecai's people. So Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. See, I can't even say it now. But this happened in the 1st month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus. They cast the pur, that is the lot, in the presence of Haman from day to day and month to month, up into the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Okay, so how many years after Esther is elevated did all of this stuff happen with Haman? She was elevated in the 7th year, and this is happening in the 12th, so it's been 5 years. She was queen for 5 years before this ever happened. That's something that we sometimes miss and don't catch up on sometimes. So that's when you see this. So during his reign, Vashti is deposed approximately 483. Esther gets elevated up in about 478. And a few years after that is when Mordecai gets elevated. We'll come to that in just a second. So by the time that Haman seeks to destroy the Jews, Esther, she's been queen for about 5 years. It's in the next year that Haman gets hung, and Mordecai is elevated in the kingdom. So there's all of these different edicts, all of these confusion. There's all this confusion about who's doing what, and why are we in so much trouble, and what's going to happen, and all those kind of things going on. So the Jews were then granted that permission to defend themselves, and they, of course, won this great victory. That's what Purim is all about. And many people became Jews because the fear of the Jews had overcome them. We read that in the end of chapter 8. And so Esther, she reveals things from the lives of those who didn't go back to Israel. Because remember, they left. They went back all the way back here. She and some of her family had stayed. And there was a lot of the Jews that never went back. A lot of them stayed. And at this point, when these things are going on, that also included Ezra and Nehemiah. And what happened to her, though, what happened there over in Persia, in Shushan and all of that, that affected even these people who did go back. They were over there, and everything that happened with Haman affected them, but everything that happened also affected all of those who went back. The temple is up and running in Esther's day. That's something that we don't always keep in mind. So all of this intrigue is going on in the superpower of the day, in Persia. And the Jewish people are slowly rebuilding their lives and rebuilding their existence in Jerusalem after the exile. So Israel was a relatively small province in this larger empire that everything is happening in. And so far, Ezra has been relating history when you read his book. But it isn't until Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes, takes the throne that he and Nehemiah actually return to Israel themselves. And I should also note, I'm probably going to get ahead of you a little bit here, dear, when you're going through Esther, but Xerxes does not die of natural causes. What's that? I have to say that. I have to say that. Yes, I do. Yes, I do. He gets killed in a palace, you want to say a palace coup. Okay? He gets killed in a palace coup. It says, now after these things, this is Ezra chapter 7. During the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, son of Sariah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, this Ezra came up from Babylon. He was a scribe, skilled in the Torah of Moses that Adonai, the God of Israel, had given. The king granted him everything he requested because the hand of Adonai, his God, was upon him. Now, I should note, he was killed in this, Xerxes was killed in this palace coup. This may have been in part because of those behind the scenes did not like the fact that two Jewish people had come to such a prominent position, with Esther and Mordecai. And if you didn't know, Artaxerxes, he is Xerxes' son, but he's not Esther's son. He was actually, I'm getting these stares. He was actually Vashti's son, the one who had been deposed before Esther was elevated. So there has been this transition in leadership, and it's likely that both Esther and Mordecai are at least been deposed and removed from their position. They might even be dead. We don't really know what exactly happened to them because Artaxerxes seemed to try and erase them from Persian history. But it wasn't apparently all hostility. Artaxerxes was still under God's influence, right? The hand of Adonai was upon him. Right? And it says that Ezra arrived in Jerusalem in the 5th month of the 7th year of the king. And he began his aliyah from Babylon on the 1st day of the 1st month and entered Jerusalem on the 1st day of the 5th month, because the good hand of his God was upon him. For Ezra had set his heart to seek the Torah of Adonai, to observe and to teach its statutes and ordinances in Israel. So when you're looking at this, Vashti is deposed and all those things happen in the book of Esther. But Ezra starts to head back in about 458 during the reign of Artaxerxes. In the 7th year of the king is when he arrives back. And he came back to work in the temple. He came back to ensure that the Torah was being enacted and obeyed and taught properly. And it's several years later from that Nehemiah returns after having a conversation with the king, after serving him some wine. You'll remember Nehemiah was the cupbearer of the king. That's a very important and trusted position. It says, then in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was set before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. And so the king said to me, why is your face so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. And I was very frightened. And that's when he has been praying to God, give me success before this man. Help me out before this man. And open the door for me, essentially. And it's from this conversation that Nehemiah gets entrusted with the governorship in Israel. He was such an honorable man in fulfilling this role that he was unwilling to even take advantage of his position, or even when it was rightfully his. It says, from the day when I was appointed to be the governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my relatives have eaten the bread allocated to the governor. So he's not taking advantage of his position. So when you see all of that, he's about around 444 BC. Nehemiah comes to Judah. And so I hope this helps. Does this help kind of get a sense of everything that's happening, or almost everything that's happening in this timeline? Right? Because like I said, I've been jumping back and forth with some of these books. But a lot of things are happening. And so you might ask, why do I bother? Why put Esther in this context even? Because I haven't really been talking about her. But these events have been going on. We've been talking about things going on in Israel. But it has to do with one of the primary lessons that come from the book of Esther and what's even going on in our day. Right? When you look at this, Esther speaks to God's movement and how he works in this world. Remember, what kind of people are we supposed to be? According to 1 Chronicles chapter 12. Right? We're supposed to be men and women who know how to interpret the signs of the times to determine what Israel should do, what we as God's people should do. That's what we're supposed to be watching for, all of these different things. So one thing in putting Esther in this context, it helps us to see that while God is moving in Israel, while God is moving among his people, while he is bringing them home, while he is rebuilding the temple, while he's rebuilding the walls, there's a whole lot of stuff still going on elsewhere in the world. There's a whole lot of larger world events that are happening in the superpowers of the day. Remember, Israel is, again, it's that relatively small province. In all the superpowers of the world, it's a blip on the news cycle when you think about it like that. Compared with the nations like Babylon, like Persia, like what's coming with Greece, what's coming with Rome. I mean, isn't that still somewhat true today? Is Israel one of the world's superpowers? Not really, as far as the grand scheme of things. Are they a force to be reckoned with? Sure. But are they considered a superpower in that sense? Not really. I mean, who are we talking about these days? We're talking about us, obviously, the United States. We're talking about Russia and China, right? Iran, to a degree, is entering into that conversation, right? So all these nations and all these great superpowers, whether they be Babylon, Persia, and Greece, or whether they be the United States and Russia and China, they're all moving and they're all acting, all while God is working and moving and still doing things in Israel. All the decisions that they are making, are many of them going to affect Israel in some way or another? Yeah. Yeah, they are. And the larger population of God's people around the world, they're going to be affected by all of these things going on. But the world and its history, when you think about who's writing the history, who's going to make a record of these events in our day, do you think in years to come, assuming that we have them all, that secular history is going to remember all of this tension and this conflict in Ukraine? Are they going to remember it and how it affected God's people or how it affected the state of Israel? Probably not. They're not going to think about it. They're not going to write about it in the sense of how God uses those events to get more Jewish people that were in Ukraine back to the land. That's not going to be one of the major points that they're going to make about these events. Are they going to analyze it in these events in ways that it moves certain nations to maybe cooperate with each other, to work together, build alliances that are eventually going to do what regarding Israel? Are they eventually going to turn against them at some point in the future? Are we potentially seeing some of those alliances and relationships being built now? Yes. Are we seeing even decisions that our nation is making, pushing that forward? Yes, we are. Because when we do things like cut Russia off of all of its financial aspects and all of its ability to make transactions, guess where they're going to go? They're already going to China. They're already doing a whole bunch of things like that. And these nations are starting to cooperate with one another in Turkey and Syria. And they're trying to get pressure, Saudi Arabia, and to say, hey, let's start using currency other than the U.S. dollar. Y'all been hearing about that? Right now, all oil is sold based upon the U.S. dollar, and they're trying to break it. So all these things are going on right now. They're not really going to look at it in the ways that, hey, I wonder if this is any connection to Ezekiel or Daniel or Revelation. Of course not. They're not going to look at it like that. They're going to talk about Zelensky. They're going to talk about Putin. They're going to talk about Biden. They're going to talk about Xi in China. They'll talk about inflation and gas prices and the threat of nuclear escalation. That's what they're going to be talking about. They're not going to be talking about, I wonder how this affects God's people. So when we see all of these things going on, in their day, just like Persian history has essentially tried to erase Esther and Mordecai and those things that are happening, they're going to try to erase the ways in which the Father has positioned his people to accomplish certain tasks. Because see, all of these guys, these incidents where people are in position to influence Cyrus, to influence Darius like Daniel, to influence Xerxes like Esther and Mordecai, to influence Artaxerxes like Esther, or like Ezra and Nehemiah. He had all of those people positioned in special places in the superpowers of the day in order to accomplish that. And so you got to think, or we got to be asking, we got to be even praying about, when you think about what's happening today, if somebody makes a timeline of what's happening now, are they going to be able to record how God has moved to save his people? Are they going to be able to go back and look at all of the players today with Biden or Zelensky or Putin and say, look, this person is positioned right here. This person is positioned right over there with Putin. Do you want people positioned in the right places with those people? Yes. We should want somebody who cares about God and loves God and is seeking God and knows his word. We should want people like that around those men and those women, because they might just have the favor of God and turn the situation in such a way that it saves everybody. Esther is a lesson in the hidden hand of God, because remember, especially when you read it in English, God is not mentioned in the entire book, right? It's the agenda of God at work in the world, while the leaders and the superpowers of the world, they think they're the ones in charge. But is that true? Are they really the ones in charge? No. And so you think about these situations, these circumstances in the book of Esther, out of nowhere, through extraordinary circumstances, a young Jewish girl is raised up to be queen. Now, who could have saw that coming? Nobody. And out of nowhere, through this blip on the radar, because of that one move, the Jewish people are saved, and her uncle, a Jewish man, is elevated to be the second person in the kingdom, to one of the most influential men on the planet. So whether they are kings or whether they are presidents, God is able and does position those whose hearts are his, and he positions them around them like Ezra, like Nehemiah. And we should hope and pray that the Father is providing favor in their eyes, just like he did for Ezra. Remember this passage? He had made this aliyah from Babylon because the good hand of his God was upon him. Do you want God's good hand on you? Do you want God's good hand on his people? Even the ones that are positioned in places that we don't necessarily expect to find them? Did any of them see this really coming? No. It is just as much of an unknown for them as things are an unknown for us. They didn't predict where their lives were going to turn out. Esther, as a young teenager, it never entered her mind that she was going to be queen in the palace. Did her uncle Mordecai know that he would, in his boring job as a scribe, did he know that he was going to spark an incident that would get almost all of his people killed? Nope. Did he imagine rising to the important government position that he did? No. But God did. He was working in their day at almost an Exodus level of deliverance. So did Ezra or Nehemiah know that they had that kind of favor from God? Were they asking for it? Yes, they were. Are we asking for it? Is a question we need to be asking ourselves. Did they know that Artaxerxes, who had deposed his father, who had erased two other Jewish people from their position, did they know that he was not going to be biased against them? They couldn't be sure of that. They didn't know any more than any of us know how things are going, or how they're going to go, or how the Father is going to position us for his purposes. And that's why I do all of this. That's why I put it in this context. Because all we know and all that we see are the same kind of things that they saw and the same kind of things that they could see. The world's superpowers in times of war, in times of conflict, and oh my goodness, it looks like they're going to kill us all. And it may turn against God's people. But we must never make the mistake of thinking that God is not working and that he is not moving in this world. We must pray to have eyes to see how he is moving, to be able to discern the times, even if it's the things, we're looking for the things that never make the news or never make your favorite websites or never get posted on Facebook. We need to be watching for how he is moving and how he is working. We must understand that we as his people, we've got to be watchful. We've got to be hopeful. We've got to be faithful. In the midst of all of this craziness that's going on, right? We've got to be those things at all times. Because again, the world superpowers, the world leaders, they're not really in control like they think they are. And he is working, and he is moving among his people, and he is accomplishing his purposes and positioning his people even now to that end. We should be hoping and praying that he's doing that. We must pray for those people in those positions. We must be open to the possibility that one of those people might be us. And no idea how that's going to take place. No idea how that would happen, how one of us could end up in one of those positions, right? But there again, did Esther see that coming? No. But she was raised up for what? For such a time as this. Pray for those people in those positions. Be open to the possibility that it could be us, and be realizing that we are living in days of fulfillment. And so we should expect to see things happen. We should expect things to be moving and working in ways that catch the world off guard. We should expect to see things happen like that happened to Esther, like happened to Mordecai, like happened to Ezra and Nehemiah. And we should hope that it's because the good hand of our God is upon us. Because he still does these kind of things, doesn't he? And everything that we see going on in the world right now is no different than how he has moved and how he has worked in the past. So may we be willing, may we be faithful to his way, his halakha, wherever we go, no matter what opposition we may face, no matter what happens, we are called to be his people. And that will not change. And so we trust him in the midst of these storms. We trust him in the midst of these kind of moments. We trust him to deliver his people. Amen.